Thank you so much, Eric. First, I'm going to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Sheldon Zhang from UMass Lowell and Dheeraj from Praxis Participatory, never get this, absolutely correct, Praxis Institute for Participatory Practices. And our presentation is a little bit of a departure from what you've listened to so far. We do not have a paper. We were funded to explore the possibility of doing a program with the nomadic, semi-nomadic, and denotified tribes in India, along with Praxis. So we received a travel grant to conduct some meetings and learn more about the situation there. So what we will be presenting on, Dheeraj will start by giving you some information about the denotified tribes, and then I will talk a little bit about what a potential program in RCT could look like if the funding were there. So without further delay, I will pass it over to Dheeraj and share our slides.
Thanks, Meredith. So I will start with first talking about who are we talking about as part of this proposed study. So first is when we talk about nomadic, semi-nomadic, and denotified tribes, we need to understand the history and from where this very term emanates. So if you look at the history, two particular years become very important. It is 1871 and 1952. So what was happening as part of the British rule, there was also a kind of identification that took place of certain communities who were tagged as criminal tribes as part of the law imposition process. And what made these tribes being segregated or separately tagged was largely they opposed the very idea of settled living and also opposed the idea of any imposition of law over them. So based on certain criteria, what we see before 1871, there were a set of regulations that tried to set up different departments that, with focus on criminal tribes. In 1871, British government enacted something called as Criminal Tribes Act, and it branded certain tribes as quote unquote born criminals, to put this in perspective. And later on, post-independence in 1952, we see that it was repealed. But again, Habitual Offenders Act came into existence. And again, in a way, it re-stigmatized the people, the very people who were listed earlier in terms of Criminal Tribes Act. And later on, what we see post-1952, there have been other legislations like Drugs and Magic Remedies, or we look at Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act or Wildlife Protection Act, which in a way put these some of the professions that were taken up by these tribes into the category of illegal. So this is the history from where this very name kind of emerged. Moving further, if we see what is the process of exclusion, or we can call it a vicious cycle. So the very tag of criminality that was inflicted in 1871, it is not that it has still been taken off. So in 1952 with Habitual Offenders Act, and after that with series of acts which in a way banned or made certain professions illegal, it in a way continued the criminal tag on these communities. When we look at the scale of the communities, what is it? We are talking about almost 1,700 different community groups, and with population of around 150 million population. What is happening? Why we are saying that there is a process of exclusion? So there is a community with an inflicted tag of criminality, and any attempt that is being made to look for alternate livelihoods or trying to create a way out of this vicious cycle is being derailed with idea of this tag, or with the stigma or the discrimination or the disposition of resources that are taking place because of this very tag itself. Now, when we look at the denotified tribes, it's a very heterogeneous group, and largely based on profession, it is divided into 4 groups. So First is around pastoralists and hunters and gatherers. Second is related to providers of services and professions. Third is about entertainers, street performers, and acrobatic performers. And fourth is about religious performers and astrologers. Moving further, if we try to look at more examples, if we try to understand the imposed illegality of profession among these communities, one is the example of brewing liquor. So there were traditional skills, particularly talking of Chara and Sansi tribal groups who had skills to brew liquor, but over the period with state imposition of laws on liquor production, this very profession became illegal. Talking about traditional sex work, it used to happen within certain patronage system, but over the period it developed into an industry with complex structure of middlemen as well as traffickers. Then third is about animal performers. And here again, we see that with very progressive acts like Wildlife Protection Act or Prevention of Cruelty Act, again, some of these professions became illegal. Then fourth example is of street performers, where these communities used to perform on streets and entertain with methods like acrobatics. But again, we see that with Prevention of Beggary Act, the streets were also denied to these groups. So overall, what we see either with the background of either legal impositions, which had a larger morality-based baggages, these very professions were stigmatized. Also, if we look at what we also did earlier as part Praxis, along with National Alliance groups, group for Denotified Tribes, did a participatory action research process, and we collected a very small sample data across 6 states, and some of the results are quite stark and talk about the deprivations that these communities face. So if we look at in the 30 plus age group, they were almost 81% of the population had never been to school. Talking of 18 to 60 years age group, we saw that only 77% of the population talk about having availability of work throughout the year. Then around 77% stated that they don't have access to work. So they have access to work which is less than 100 days in a year. Talking about income levels, almost 81% of the households earned less than $77 per month. Then talking about caste certificates, which are one of the central documents or core critical document that they should have for accessing any of the affirmative action measures. So what we see, almost 88% of households did not have their caste certificates, which could have given them access to some of these provisions. Among the elementary school age group children, which is 6 to 14 age group, almost 40% of the children either they had dropped out of school or they had never been to school. Then if we talk about social security programs related to food provisions, then 28% of households did not have any access to these cards. Some of the other stark figures, if we look at almost 69% of the households had outstanding debt, which shows the level of dependency or deprivation that they are facing. Talking about another key figure would be with regard to their interface with the state system. So out of the households, all the households covered, only 11% of them stated that they had either complained or sent some kind of feedback to government system, while only 1% there stated that any sort of action was taken. And if you look at their interface with the private sector, we see that at least there were 10 instances where any attempt to reach out to private sector for job opportunities was denied because of their very identity. So these are the kind of marginalizations that we can see clearly that are being faced by the community. Moving further, if we look at some of the core demands from the community side, First is related to having a very clear institutional mechanism to stop police violence as well as the labeling of the community. Second is with regard to access to quality education. And we have seen that even when there are attempts to reach out to school system, children end up moving out of those very institutions because of the stigma and the labeling that they face. Then third is about livelihood opportunities where community is looking for access to more resources, credit, as well as alternative livelihood options for them. Fourth is around land rights and into land grabbing. What we see that almost more than 80% of the community does not have any legal entitlements to their land. So that is where community is clearly demanding to have access to legal entitlements vis-a-vis land. Fifth is about identity documents to access rights. And last one is about having affirmative action or reservation provisions so that community is able to very clearly have their presence in the local institutional systems as well as able to take their share in the larger entitlement provisioning. So with this, I would like to hand it over to my colleague Meredith.
Thank you so much, Dheeraj. There's a lot to digest here. I think it's really important to stress that very little to no research has been done with the Denotified tribes. And so the work that Praxis has been doing with the community directly is incredibly important and helpful in filling that knowledge gap when it comes to the tribes and their vulnerability to all types of trafficking, not only sex trafficking through the intergenerational sex work, but also forced labor. So, you know, when Sheldon and I had the opportunity to visit with Praxis, some of the Denotified tribes in Madhya Pradesh in April of this year, what we learned a few key things that would need to happen in order for a program to be put in place. And then if a RCT was to be done, what would need to happen in order for that to occur. I think what Dheeraj has stressed through the work that they've done is that any intervention with this community must be done on a participatory approach. I mean, I think an argument could be made that that's the case with majority of research in this space and in this field, but particularly for this community who is understandably distrustful of a lot of people and people from different communities and backgrounds, having the community itself and training them and building their capacity, not only to do the work, but to you know, sustain the programs that are built within the communities is incredibly important. And so using key community members as mobilizers and coordinators is the only way that, that any kind of programming would work. So focusing on critical aspects where impact can be detected easily. So if the idea is to reduce trafficking, again, whether it be labor and or sex or the vulnerability to trafficking, we, along with the community members that we met with, identified some key areas and see programmatic interventions that would be incredibly impactful in reducing that vulnerability. And that's obtaining proper legal documents, or the caste certificate, as Dheeraj had pointed out, for these members so that they could then apply for government schemes, they could apply for other types of legal jobs and so forth. Improving access to higher education. So there are currently some pathways, but there are a lot of challenges to individuals getting access to that higher education. A lot of the colleges and universities are located far away from where D&T communities reside. So transportation issues are a huge piece to this, but then, you know, making sure that they have the proper funding and whatnot to stay in school is incredibly important. And then developing economic opportunities or livelihood opportunities that are viable and sustainable to traditional lifestyles, all the different types of employment that Dheeraj had pointed out. If the desire and the hope is to get out of that and look for more viable opportunities working, whether it be in the tech sector, educational sector, agricultural sector, making sure that those pathways, again, are viable and that they are earning a living wage so that they can remain in them and not have to fall back on these other types of employment and work in order to sustain their livelihoods. So if there was funding to create a program that addressed these three key points, what would then happen? So the D&T communities are target-rich environments for measurable social interventions. So in talking to them about, would they be open to research occurring, particularly in an evaluation design like a randomized control trial? Universally, everybody seemed okay with that. There would have to be certain care taken as far as what kind of RCT was done, something similar to like a wait list where everybody would eventually get access to the type of programming that is created there. But there would be initially an experimental control group. 2 study sites would be preferable for validation and contrasting purposes. So again, in conversations with Praxis, some of the communities in the north who might be more known for the intergenerational sex work, and in the south where there's more documentation of some of those other illegal activities such as alcohol production and things of that sort, looking at forced labor within that would be preferable. D&T communities are typically isolated, primarily because within the caste system, they are forced to be isolated from other people. So, from a research perspective, there are clearer boundaries as a result, which would be ideal for a cluster-based randomized design, or alternatively a step wedge design, as I had mentioned before. A lot of these communities are divided into hamlets, and there are several hundred households within each hamlet. So there is definitely opportunity not only to do, start with the prevalence baseline study that Abby Long had mentioned from JTIP, but then to also do a very in-depth intervention program, and to then do an end-line study to see if there was a reduction in trafficking. So within each hamlet, broader indicators can be developed to measure, detect changes. And for greater in-depth, a minimum of 10 eligible participants will be randomly selected to participate. These are all, again, conceptual in a panel-based cohort for repeated follow-ups, because ideally you want to follow up to see if the programs are working and they are reducing those individuals' risk of entering into different types of work in industries that would increase their vulnerability to trafficking. And you would need an observation period of at least 18 months or longer to really determine if the intervention programs will have an impact. So again, very different from what was originally shared with the other panelists, very interesting ways to look at all of this. But from a conceptual standpoint, working with this community, even doing, from the key demands, looking at what they are looking for specifically, and at least trying to create programming around that can have a huge impact with this community.